All right, so I want to get into annotation, like text and dimensioning objects. But before I can do that, I want to go over what are called viewports and the difference between paper space and model space. Because annotation, like text and dimensions, can be used in either paper space or model space, but it has different effects depending on which working area you're in. So let's start with what is model space and what is paper space. And I kind of briefly explained this earlier, but model space you can think of as your working area, your blank canvas to start drafting or modeling objects. Paper space, on the other hand, is a workspace that's meant to simulate paper. Now, you can't tell that right now, um, because I don't have any kind of a border or anything. What I've got is this kind of ghosted line, which is representative of a piece of paper. That border can change in size and proportions depending on how I have that page set up laid out. And when you right click on a layout tab, you can you have a bunch of different options, and one of those is the page setup manager, where you can create new page setups. This is to say maybe you have different types of settings that you want to apply. A good example for this is the place where I work. We have two printers that we use. One of them prints to 11 by 17 and 8.5 by 11, small sizes. We have a large format printer that prints 22 by 34, 24 by 36 D-size paper. What I do on my drawings is I create two different layouts, two different page setups, one for the smaller paper size and one for the larger paper size. And what this allows me to do is to choose which layout I want to use when I'm printing. And you can apply that layout to whatever your current tab is. So right now we have two layout tabs. You can have as many layout tabs as you want, simulating different pages in a drawing set. Say you got a house, right? You got floor plans, you got elevations, maybe you got like a framing plan, or something like that, an electrical plan. Well, what you can do is make separate layouts for that. Let's say I want to call this my floor plan. I can double click the name of this layout tab and call it the floor plan. I can double click the name of this one and call it the elevation. Okay. You see I've got a box here with a house inside of it that I previously drew, and I'll explain what that is right now actually. So to really effectively to make use of paper space, we can create what are called viewports. And viewports are windows into model space. So let's go ahead and I'm going to give you a disclaimer right now. I actually don't use the ribbon. So typically, if you see me a little slow with the ribbon, that's why. I do a lot of things through command line. And I'm trying not to use command line right now because I know it can be kind of hard to see me type everything, and you might miss some things, but I'm not finding where viewports are at, again, because I don't use the what do you call it, the ribbon. So I'm actually going to have to, in this case, type it in because I don't know if I'm looking for it. As you can tell, this channel is very off the cuff. Nothing here is scripted. I do everything off the cuff. So I'm just going to create a new viewport from the command line by typing in viewports. And it brings up the viewport window. There's a toolbar that allows you to create a new viewport much faster than this. But for now, I'm going to click single, because you can have like split viewports. I'm going to choose single and just say OK. And I can pick 2 points to create this viewport. And again, it is a window into model space. If I look here in model tab, this is what's inside my viewport. And if I double click inside the viewport, I'm now actively in model space. Think of paper space as like a piece of tracing paper on top of model space, essentially, or like a view box, a window that you're looking into model space from paper space. And why would you do this? Well, in a lot of industries, whenever you create drawings, you need to give those drawings a scale so that if somebody were to have a printout, they can take like an architectural or engineering scale and measure out things on that drawing with that engineering or architectural scale. So you want to have things that are printed to scale. Viewports allow you to easily print objects to scale. So I'm going to set the scale of this viewport. You can do that when it's selected. You'll notice down here, this area where the status toggles are at, I get some additional options. One of those is the scale of the viewport. So I'm going to select this, and I've got some default scales. These are all engineering scales, and I've got some architectural scales. Maybe I'll choose something. These are kind of like on the, here we go, this is what I'm looking for. Maybe something like a 3/8 scale. That's not too bad. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. So viewports are objects like rectangles and lines and all that. You can do a couple things with them. One of the things you can do is stretch with either using the stretch command, or you can just grab one of the grips. Unlike a rectangle, which will stretch just this corner, viewports, when you grab a corner, will stretch that entire side. So, all right. So I've got this viewport set at a 3/8 scale. So if I were to print this thing out on a piece of paper, it would be able to accurately be scaled at 3/8 of an inch scale, which, you know, architectural scales have that scale. All right, now that I got my viewport, what can I do with this? What can I do to flesh this out into a drawing? Well, first, let's give ourselves a little bit of working room in the paper space. I'm gonna bring this viewport close to my object. I don't need to have all kinds of extra space. I just want to be able to see, or have that viewport lined up right to the edge of my object. From here, now I can start annotating and dimensioning. And the reason I have to explain the difference between paper space and model space is because in paper space, you're working on a simulated paper size. So, and this looks like it's set up for an 8.5 by 11. So I'm going to, on floor plan, I'm going to go to modify, and here it is. There's no plotter set. I'm just going to put it to the AutoCAD's PDF printer will be the setup. And we'll use, see here it says 8.5 by 11. That's fine. We'll use 8.5 by 11 paper. What to plot, we're going to say extents. And we're not going to fit to paper. We're just going to leave it all at 1:1. Okay. So this is another lot of options here. This page setup that dialog box is exactly the same, almost exactly the same as the print dialog box. So I'll go over this, especially when I get to printing, or when I get further in depth and do how to set up how to do page setups. We want to center this. So before I can go any further, I want to create a boundary. So we said it was going to be 8.5 by 11 paper, right? So I'm going to make my paper just a little bit smaller. I'm going to make a border with dimensions of 10.5, 10.5 inches by 8 inches. Okay, that looks pretty darn close. So if I go to my page setup manager and double click to make sure this is current, so you can kind of go back and forth between your setups. You can say set current, or here set current. So yeah, this elevation doesn't have anything set up yet. So I'm going to hit close. Page setup manager. Yeah, we can't modify elevation yet. So we should be good to go. 8.5 by 11 inches. We wanted to save this to actually. I just realized I think I modified. Yeah, extents. I think I modified my elevation layout, not my floor plan. Okay, perfect. All right, cool. Close. All right, so I've got a border now, and I can start annotating inside this border. Now, granted, my paper is a little bit small, but bear with me here. So under your annotate tab, and some of these things in the annotate tab reflect what you're going to see here in on the home tab, and you've got like text and dimension and things like that. I was avoiding this earlier. This is going to be really common annotation. Your two most popular things you're going to use is your text and your linear dimension or quick dimension. If you go to your annotate tab, you're going to see some of the same things. except you just see more options. You have more dimension types, um, uh, more text options, which you can do, like with these settings over here. You can create tables. That's a whole tutorial in itself. Quick access to wipeouts, revisions, um, and now I'm not ashamed to say the one thing that I may not go over till later on, if at all, is annotative objects, because I myself and almost nobody in my industry works with annotative objects. I work in oil and gas design doing, I think I might have said this in my intro video, doing structural design. And every company I've worked for, nobody has done annotative. It has its uses, but maybe more architectural, or maybe some companies use it, but nobody uses it. So I haven't had the need to get well versed in annotative objects. I've stayed away from that. So I probably won't go through annotation and all that, like annotative objects in this section with scaling and all that. All right, I'm rambling. Let's get to it. So starting with the home tab, we've got single line text and multi-line text. The default is going to be multi-line text, which is mtext. If you click this big A, you're going to get multi-line text. Okay, I'm going to start with single line text first, just because it's easier to start with. There's less options. Single line text, what happens is when you hit text, it asks you for options, justification, or style. We've only got one text style in this drawing, but you can create multiple styles for different fonts, like for titles or for regular text or whatever you need. Or you can choose a justification, center, left, right, things like that. I'm going to leave the default. Specify text height. I'm going to use a text height of what's pretty common in my industry of 330 seconds. I know it seems a little kind of an odd number, but it is what it is. It's pretty close to 0.1, which a lot of companies use as well. And the rotation of the text, I'm going to leave it 0. And just start typing in. Maybe we'll type in something like house. I'll do it in caps. Okay. Now this is the size of the text. Admittedly pretty small. I'm going to move this over here. And it looks like the default style is set to Arial, which is fine. A lot of times I see something like, and I'll go to style here. And styles where you can adjust, where you can create styles and adjust the fonts and sizes and all that. You can pick just about any font you want, but I see a lot of Roman S is very common, and also simplex is pretty common. So here's simplex in Roman S. I'll leave Arial for now though. That's fine. So there, and it's left justified. So the thing about single line text is we just created a single line. And I'll do this again. I'll hit my single line text, right? Let's say I'm going to use some examples like line 1, right? And I hit enter. I can say line 2, enter, and just keep doing this, right? Now what happens is once I hit enter and then I hit enter again, it finishes the command out. And if you look, each one of these is a separate object. Single line text creates separate objects. And that's it. There's nothing else you can do as far as editing other than like hidden commands. I say hidden commands like you can control U to do underline. You cannot control B to bold or control I to italicize, but you can control U to underline. You can enter codes that are special to AutoCAD, like U plus, actually some what do they call them? Unicode characters, like I use U2104 every so often. Arial apparently does not display it, but it creates a centerline logo. Or you can do the other kind, which is I think holding Alt and doing something like 0216 will create the diameter logo, or symbol or whatever. I think what is it? Alt 0172 does, or 0176. I can't remember which one it was. Something like that creates the degrees symbol. There's also AutoCAD has special functions like %% will do diameter, %% D will do degrees, %% P will do plus or minus. These can all be input in single line text, okay? But there's not a lot of formatting available to you. That's where multi-line text comes into play. So multi-line text, and it looks like this will choose whatever you had last. So we'll do multi-line text. you creates a you pick 2 points to create a window for your text, and you get kind of a full-fledged text editor up here. If you don't have the ribbon enabled, this editor will be floating above the text box, and you'll see that later on, because I will eventually get rid of this ribbon. I'm doing it now for familiarity's sake, and because it's part of the default AutoCAD setup, I'm using the ribbon, but it's not my preferred setup. I use toolbars, and you'll see me using toolbars later when I eventually change this layout or workspace out. All right, so from here, you have different options. You can change your text height. Right now we're at 330 seconds, which it is rounding to 1/8. But let's say I wanted to make a title that's larger. I can do something like 3/16. I can choose whether I want to put a mask on it. A mask is just, if it's on top of anything, I can put a color behind it or make it use the background color. I'll get into masks later. I'll show you mask in a second. But and a lot of this stuff can be edited after the fact in the properties palette, which I have not gone over yet, but I desperately need to. Okay, you can choose your font, choose the color. Here you can actually bold, underline, italicize. A lot of your pretty standard text editing functions, your justification, but you can do more than just center, middle, and right. You can also choose its vertical location within the text box, or whether you want it to be fit, your line spacing. You can do bullets. You can enter all these symbols. Here's what I was showing you talking about earlier. You can do symbols that again here, if it's finally displaying the centerline symbol in this particular text box. It wasn't doing it in single line. So you can make columns. I don't work with columns. In fact, whenever I have the option to set up the text, I put no columns. Columns just kind of complicate things for me. I'd prefer to just put 2 different text boxes, but you can have columns per se. All right. And fields are an interesting thing and very powerful and super awesome to work with. But all right, so I'm just gonna start typing. Here I'll do house again, right? And it looks like I changed my font, and I really want to go back to Arial or maybe Roman S. This is again pretty popular. You can also change your width factor, which formatting is right up in here. This is your oblique factor. This is your spacing. They call it tracking, but it's spacing between the characters, and then your width factor. One is pretty wide. A lot of times I see 0.85 or 0.8 or something along those lines. It just makes things a little bit more condensed. You can fit more annotation in there. So I'm doing this. I'll maybe Control U and center justify. Maybe I'll do this. Maybe I'll go justification middle center. There we go. And as I adjust the length of this, it adjusts that. If I bring this all the way to 0, all it does is okay. So on the mtext editor, this kind of controls text wrapping. Okay, so let's say I have, I really enjoy using AutoCAD. Yay. Okay. As I expand this, you can see that it controls text wrapping. If I take this all the way down to 0, it does not create a black hole like you think it would. What it does is it means it will just keep typing further and further and further, enter, until I decide to hit enter. Okay, it's user controlled line space or returns. So if I go back and re-expand this, notice how this does not change because I manually hit the enter key on these. So only the one line that I chose not to hit enter on, that gets resized. It might be a little it might be a little weird to understand at first, but it gets easier as you work more and more with mtext. So I'll go back and change this to house, and that's all it is. If I want to edit text after the fact, there's a couple ways you can do this. One of the most standard ways is just type in edit, or not edit, I'm sorry, ed, which is text edit. It's the shorthand for text edit. Under modify, there is no edit button. Technically the easiest way is to double click. You're like, why didn't you start with that? Well, because a lot of times it's not enabled or it gets disabled. You may not be working with a bare bones copy of AutoCAD. You might be working for a company, and they might have some settings set to where the double click is disabled, and it's right here. Windows standard behavior, double click editing. If that is disabled, you cannot double click edit text. Okay. So if you find yourself in a situation where you can't double click the text, you'll need to type in ED to edit text, or you'll need to go to your options, user preferences, and turn that double click editing back on so you can edit that. Okay. Easiest way to edit text is just double click it. Brings up your editor all over again. Same thing with single line editing, only you don't get the full-fledged option. Notice how that full-fledged editor is not here. All you can do is just edit the text. And they've got their advantages for both of them. They really do. I use both constantly, especially for quick text. I like using single line for quick single lines of text. But for, big blocks of text and things like that, I'll use or for specialized text, I'll use the mtext. It's purely a preference most of the time. All right, so that's text. You're going to use that a lot. So beyond that, moving beyond text, right? Let's put this up here as a title for our house, okay? As we wanted dimensions. So quick dimension, which is pretty much what this is. This is a quick dimension, is where you select an object and it makes the dimension on that object. The thing about quick dimensioning is that, and it looks like it's going to do either or. You can't select an object inside of a viewport. Notice how, well, you can and you can't, but really, it's kind of tricky-ish. You see how, I have to kind of move in here? More realistically, you're going to pick 2 points. Like that. Okay? Or you can choose linear. Linear won't even give you the option. It won't get all quirky like that. You do linear, you just pick 2 points. And this is the more standard way to do things. Because a lot of times you may not be measuring the distance, but across a line. Here, the 2 points that I dimensioned here to get the length, those are in the same plane, the same object. But what if you're not doing that? You know what I mean? What if I'm up here? I'm gonna erase these, and what if I'm dimensioning from this wall to this opening? Right? It's not going to give me an angled dimension. It's going to give me a linear dimension if I chose linear, which means I'm going to either get a vertical dimension this way or I'm going to get a horizontal dimension this way. Those are the only two options for linear dimension. If you want a different type, you can use a different type, and there's lots of them. There's a line, so you will get that angle if you measure from there to there, which has its uses. Angular for measuring the angle, the distance, the angle between two lines. Arc length will give you the length of an arc. If I have an arc and I choose arc length, it gives me that actual distance along that arc, which is the same as, well, I really got to get to the properties menu. Let me get the dimensions and I'll get into the properties menu. Okay. I should have talked about that on the last video, but it's all good. Okay, so you've also got the radius and diameter of a circle. Ordinate shows the coordinate of something in model space. So if I click this, it's showing me the actual value of this corner, like what the distance is from the origin point. It's saying that, and this is in the y-axis. If I go this way, this is in the x-axis. It's saying that that's the distance from the x and y axis. Okay. All right. Key thing to note about dimensions when dimensioning things, and I'm going to stick to linear because it's what I'm going to use probably 95% of the time. When you dimension something in model space inside of a viewport, it will automatically scale the dimension. Notice how this says 120 inches because I made this 10 feet long, right? But notice how this says 10.5, right? How can something smaller have a bigger dimension? That's because the viewport is scaling the dimension for me. If I were to go and measure that using a distance command, which you can measure without having to go inside the viewport, you can measure from here as long as you're measuring just model space objects. I click one point to the next and you can see my measurement says 10 feet. And yes, there are controls to modify the behavior of dimensions, because you'll see that it's returning 120 inches instead of saying 10 feet. That's modifying the dimension styles, which is I'll do a video about that, because that's kind of a lot to go through as far as dimension styles. There's a few tabs on that. When you go to modify, you can modify a lot of these settings that change a lot of aspects of dimensions. So, but I just want to quickly run over how to make dimensions. So dimensions are important for measuring things. If you've ever looked at a floor plan, you'll see dimensions all over the place, and you'll see strings of dimensions. You'll see overall dimensions like this, and then you'll see maybe something in between like this. And you can line them up by snapping. As this moves outward, I can snap to this dimension and then keep it going. Okay, and then I can stretch the dimension after the fact by choosing the whole dimension, choosing just a corner of the dimension, or just grabbing a grip and moving it out. Okay. I forgot where I was going with this, but scaling dimensions. These are all automatically scaled. But when I dimension something outside of the model, outside of the viewport, it's going to give me the true dimension. Like if I were to dimension the viewport itself, this is the true dimension. If I were to print this whole paper up, this border would be 10.5 inches long. This viewport would be 4.049495 inches long. Now, this is not 120 inches long physically. The viewport has scaled it. It's given a multiplication factor. Remember how I told you that this is a 3/8 scale? So if you were to bust out your 3/8 scale and measure this, it would measure out to 10 feet. If you busted out a regular ruler and measure this, it'd probably be like 4 inches. So that's how viewports apply scaling. And they apply the scaling automatically. You can override that scaling if you need to. And you will need to override scaling for dimensions if you dimension things in model space. I do not recommend working in model space, but a lot of companies do it. I used to do it for a long time in architectural. And before I got familiar with viewports and paper space, I drafted in model space, everything in model space. And it's a lot more difficult because a lot of your details need to be scaled up, and so your dimensions have to be dialed back. It's kind of crazy. So everything here is on a smaller scale because we're working with a smaller piece of paper. Okay, if you draft in model space, everything has to be scaled up. If I want to print this and I want to annotate this in model space, I can't put an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. I have to scale it up. So in order for me to scale up, let's say I want this to be 3/8 scale still. Okay, bear with me here. There are what are called scale factors. To figure out a scale factor, you need to take 12 and divide it by the scale, which in this case is 3/8. Okay, so you can actually do a little formula in a calculator. And AutoCAD has a built-in calculator. Type in cal, and you can say 12 divided by, and in parentheses say 3/8, and the answer you're going to get is 32. Okay, because what 3/8 is 0.375. So if I repeat that, it's 12 divided by 0.375, which is 32. That's the scale factor. What that means is if I drew a paper in model space that was, and I'll do a rectangle with a dimension of 11 by 8.5. Look how small that is. That's literally the same size as this paper, but I'm in model space now. So compared to the house, it's tiny because the house is 10 feet tall. For me to get this paper to look like this, I need to scale it up. And if I want this to be 32, sorry, if I want this to be a 3/8 scale, I need to use that scale factor we figured out, which is 32. Now, this looks relatively close to that. Okay? All right, that's not the only thing you have to scale. You have to scale up your dimensions. And this goes into dimension styles, because now if I go and provide a linear dimension on this, you can see how tiny it is. And the reason it's so tiny is because my dimension style is not set up for model space. I guess we'll finally get to take a look at that properties window. So just type in PR for properties, and you can select a dimension, and you can see all the properties of that dimension, and you can modify them after the fact. So in this case, one of the easiest things to do to scale up a dimension is under the Fit tab. You can do dim scale overall and kind of toy with what you want your factor to be. I could do 32, and if I did 32, it would look just like the one over here. You see I was over in the floor plan, and if I did one from here, let's see, dim linear from here to here, it basically looks exactly the same because I chose my scaling to be that scale factor 32. It doesn't have to be 32 because it's just graphically making everything bigger. It's scaling up the arrow, the lines, the text. Everything's getting scaled by 32, but the dimension doesn't actually change. So I could change this to 24 and make it look a little better, or 16. Right now it looks decent. It looks more like a real dimension. And now, you know, everything's been scaled up. Okay, so you have to play with scaling and sizing. And there's ways to do that. I can go through that when I get into the dimension styles. But understand that there is a difference between model space and paper space and how you detail and annotate. When I go do my text, I can no longer do 3/16 text. I'm gonna need to do something that's more along the lines of 4-inch text. Okay, and it looks huge, like holy crap, it's huge, but it's really not. If I type in test and then just click outside here to return it, and okay, now it's more reasonable. So this is 4-inch text as opposed to the 3/16 or 3/32 I was using in model space. Basically, everything's got to be scaled up. So, and this is really, really important to know. I know this is one of the videos where I just kind of drone on a bit more about one particular aspect, but this is really important because drafting is just a small part of what you do. Annotation is a huge part. Sure, you have to draw something like drawing a house, but that's not enough. You know, essentially your drawings that you do are going to either get manufactured or they're going to get built in some way or other. And you have to provide the instructions for that craftability, if you will. And annotation and dimensioning are crucial to that end. So being able to adequately share information and show how you can build this thing is really, really important. So along with annotation, one of the last major things is leaders. Leaders are they're just arrows with text attached to them. There's a few different types, but the two main types are there's leaders, and then there's multi-leaders. So a regular leader, well, you pick a point and you start, and actually I'm going to do this over here in paper space because I think it's scaled for that. All right, so you see it draws the arrowhead, and after I pick a point, and then I pick a second point. See, I want to have a little tail for it. It's gonna, I can just keep clicking other additional points, or I can just go to the next line. Okay, so I'm gonna hit enter, and it's saying first line of annotation or options. Now at this point I can start typing. It says enter first line of annotation, so I can just be like, I don't know, test. And our next line, I don't want another line. Okay, and there's my first line. Okay, and if you can see, if I move this, that kind of goes with it. Now really, if this wasn't here, it would work even better. The leader style is not set up correctly, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. But it's nice because if you move this, essentially this should go with it if the leader's set up correctly. Another thing you can do, which I've done a lot of, is just creating a leader with no text. Say you want to add your own multi-line text later or something along those lines. So just click here, and when you hit enter, when it asks you for your first line of text, you just hit enter for options, and it's asking you, do you want to do m-text or one of these other options. You could say none, and that's it. You just have a leader with no text. So along those lines, as far as leaders go, there's another one called it just says leader, but it's really multi-leader. because it even says here in the tooltip, if you can read that, creates a multi-leader object. So we're going to click that, and the command for that is mleader. So here it already gives that tail right there, and it automatically goes straight into the text editor, and you can see up here now it's a bit smarter. Now I have like the full-on text editor, just like I do with regular multi-line text. I can do all the same things. Okay, and if I want to come back and edit this, I can do that. I got the same full-fledged editor. On top of that, it's got additional things that make it a bit more powerful than a standard leader. I can, let's say I want to put this like out here. I can hover over the grip here and say add leader and add one there. And you can keep adding them actually. I'm just going to hit escape. You can make the landing for this longer. You can give your leaders additional vertices. Hover over the end of it and it says add vertex. Or remove that leader entirely by just saying remove leader. You can adjust some of these things in the properties menu too. Again, the properties menu gives you access to a lot of different things, a lot of different properties of pretty much any object. So it's important to keep that in mind. I really don't have to say too much about it because that's what it does. You select a viewport, you get options for the viewport. You select a dimension, you get options for a dimension. Any object you select, the properties menu will show you the properties of that object. You pick multiple objects and it's going to show you just a few common things you can change among them, like the layer and the line type. But you can it'll show you what's been selected. 4 dimensions selected, 1 viewport selected, 1 polyline selected. And then from here you can pick which one, and then you can modify that particular one. So the properties menu will just show you information you can modify after the fact, and some things are just better to be modified through the properties menu. I usually keep mine open all the time. So all right, so we've covered the main facets of annotation: text, dimensioning, and leaders. In the annotation tab, there are other things. There are other types of dimensions. There's things like dim continue, which is really awesome. Dim continue is like if you do a linear dimension and you want to just keep doing a string of dimensions, you can hit continue and click once here and click another one here. You just keep clicking point to point and it just continues that string of dimensions. So there's also baseline dimensions, which are more for like assemblies. I'm not really going to go into that, but it essentially makes like another dimension on top of it, and it creates like a certain gap between them. So I'll probably do a video dedicated to everything that is dimension. I'll make advanced videos for all these topics to fully go into them, so you can really understand all the ins and outs of these things. But for just so the basics here really just familiarize you with this. And I know, again, this feels, I don't know how long I've been running now, but this feels like a longer video. But annotation is one of those things where there's a lot of options. It seems simple, and it is simple just to throw down some text and throw down some dimensions, but you'd be surprised at how many options are really available to you. Tables I'll get into, creating multi-leader styles I'll get into. I'll do videos for each one of those in particular. The last two things I'll go over real quickly, since they're already here on the tab, are wipeouts and revision clouds. Wipeouts are objects that you create that wipe out other objects behind them. They create a cover. So it's like a polyline. You can keep making as many as you want, as many points, and then what happens is, if I move this over here, it covers the objects behind them. Like, well, why would you want to do that? Well, okay, hypothetically speaking, bear with me here. Let's say I have a leader, okay, like an M leader, and I put it right here, and I say floor, okay? Let's say that I want to create a wipeout because this is overlapping this wall, so I want to cover that. So I can choose wipeout, and I can actually start drawing, or I can choose a polyline if I've created one. So earlier you saw me draw one, Let's see what happens if I create a rectangle and I go to Wipeout. Now it's asking me to pick points or do a polyline. I'm going to just right click and say polyline. I can select that polyline and it says, do I want to erase the polyline, yes or no? You can choose to keep the P line or you can erase it. I'm going to say yes, erase the polyline. Now, I've also covered my word, which is like, that doesn't do you any good. The way to get around this is by changing the draw order. I don't know if the draw order is on the home tab. And I don't see it here. So I'm gonna go to, again, I know this through my toolbars. So under tools, you'll see draw order, and you're gonna want to say bring to front. That, and it's kind of like other websites or applications where you can create a order of layers that go on top of things. Photoshop has this. There is a draw order to things. And what happens is, as you draw things, those things get put on top of other things. So because I drew the wipeout last, it got put on top of the floor text. So I just wanted to bring the floor to the front. I don't want to send the wipeout to the back, or it's going to go behind the viewport. Okay, but you can still see this bounding box. You're like, what good is a wipeout if it has a bounding box on it? So the way to get rid of that, there's two ways, but the easier way is you just type in T-frames. It is probably the first variable I'm going to teach you. That's kind of non-standard. Just type in T-frames, and it toggles the wipeout off. It's still there. You can still select it and resize it. It's just hidden. Now you won't see the boundary of that wipeout, and it creates a nice little background block out so that we can easily see this text to come through. Wipeouts can be very, very handy, but don't forget about them. A lot of people forget. If you get into a drawing and you see some missing parts, like maybe this leader gets erased, but this thing is still missing, keep in mind that's probably a wipeout. Type in T-frames to get that toggle that border back on, and you can see it's a wipeout. Okay. The last thing here is a revision cloud. A revision cloud is like if I make a change to something and I have to issue a revision, you're going to want to do a revision cloud. And you can choose to whether you wanted to use an object like a P line for your revision cloud, or make it rectangular or polygonal. I'm just going to choose rectangular. Okay. And then just choose a rectangular P line. And that's it. That's all there is to it. And again, I'll probably go over that in more detail later on, but that kind of covers the basics for revision of the clouds. So that's it for now. This video has gone on long enough. I'll probably go in more in depth on each one of these things in their own specific videos.